Hello, folks. Before we slip into tonight's darkness, tap like and subscribe. It keeps the nightmares coming. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time the shadows found you. Ready? Let's begin. The morning I found our gelding dead in his stall was the moment I finally realized we weren't just dealing with difficult neighbors anymore. I'm writing this from my brother's place in Cleveland, almost 500 miles away from the farm my wife, Allison, and I poured ourselves into for nearly 6 years. Back in 2018, we left our cramped apartment in Toledo and moved south to rural Ohio, chasing that dream of independence. We bought 42 acres outside of Gallipolis, rolling pasture land with oak trees along the ridges and a shallow creek running through the bottom. Allison had inherited a modest sum when her grandfather passed, and I had been saving since high school, working construction and driving delivery trucks on the weekends. Together, we scraped together enough to buy the land from the Whitmans, an older couple who had worked a small dairy there for decades until their health made it impossible to keep up. When we signed the deed, Mrs. Whitman pulled Allison aside and whispered something I will never forget. "Be careful with the Brenners next door. They don't like sharing ground that used to be theirs." At the time, I thought she meant the usual country wariness toward outsiders. I wish I had asked her what she really meant. The Brenners owned nearly 400 acres surrounding our land on 3 sides. The patriarch, Walter Brenner, had to be around 70, though he looked younger in the way men hardened by farm work sometimes do. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, and he had shoulders like a fence post. His 2 sons, Dwight and Travis, were near carbon copies, just younger and meaner looking. Travis especially carried a permanent scowl because of an old scar that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Their place looked like a junkyard, rusting tractors, broken equipment, packs of half-wild dogs chained to barrels. The first time we met them was unsettling. They showed up uninvited while we were unloading boxes, just stood along our fence line, staring for nearly half an hour before Walter finally called out. He asked if we would consider selling, offered us exactly what we had paid, claimed the parcel had belonged to their grandfather until the Depression forced the family to sell part of it. We told them politely we were not interested, that we planned to raise vegetables and a few animals. Walter nodded slowly, spit tobacco juice into the grass, and said, "We'll see how long you last." At first, things were fine. We tilled the garden beds, put up fencing, and bought some chickens and goats. Our prize was a chestnut gelding named Copper that Allison adored. That is when the accidents began. One morning we woke to find the chicken pen open, half the flock wandering onto the county road. 2 were struck by a passing car. A week later, our new tiller disappeared from the barn, only to reappear 3 weeks later, dumped in the creek behind our pasture, ruined by water and mud. A stormless night shattered every pane in Allison's greenhouse, glass littering the tomato plants inside. Each time something happened, the next day the Brenners would drive by slow, waving with smirks. Walter always had some comment ready. "Farming's tough work. Lots of city folks give up quick. That land's cursed anyway." My daddy always said it should have stayed Brenner land. Then came the harassment. Travis took to driving his old Ford along our fence at dawn, laying on the horn for half a minute at a time, claiming he was checking his cattle. He did not keep cattle in that pasture. The escalation came one Saturday in early September. I was in town picking up feed when Allison called, her voice so broken I could barely understand her. Copper was thrashing in his stall, froth dripping from his mouth, eyes rolling back white. By the time I got home, our vet had already arrived, but it was too late. Copper was dead. The vet found traces of antifreeze in his water bucket. Someone had poisoned him deliberately. We called the sheriff's office. Deputy Rogers came out, took photos, asked questions, wrote in his notebook, but his expression told me everything. Without direct evidence, there was not much he could do. When I mentioned the Brenners were our only neighbors for miles, Rogers gave me a helpless look. Walter's brother's been sheriff here 12 years. Best thing you can do is get cameras. That night, we did not sleep. Allison sobbed on the couch while I sat by the front window with my father's shotgun across my knees, watching the dark. At 3 a.m, I spotted headlights creeping down our driveway, stopping just shy of the motion sensor lights. The truck sat idling for nearly 10 minutes, then reversed back into the night. The next morning, our entire vegetable crop, 6 months of labor, was dead. Every row drenched in herbicide. A smell of chemicals burned our eyes from 50 feet away. And in the front yard, carved into the grass in letters 10 feet tall, was a message. Last chance. Allison begged me to leave. Pack up, walk away, forget the dream. But anger made me stupid. That afternoon, I drove to the Brenner property. Their dogs went wild as I pulled in. Walter stepped out of the barn first. Dwight and Travis close behind. Their sister-in-law, Janine, stood on the porch watching silently, arms crossed. I stayed in the truck, shotgun visible behind the seat. I told Walter I knew what they had done, that we had photos, and if anything else happened, I would take it to every newspaper and station in the state. He walked up slow, leaned in through my open window, and I will never forget what he said. "Boy, you don't know what you are stirring up. This ground has been ours since before your granddaddy was born." The Whitmans knew their place. They stayed quiet. You come here with your organic this, sustainable that, talking about buying more land, putting up fancy signs in town. That ends now. You have got till Sunday to be gone. We will buy your land for half what you paid. Or you can stay and find out what happens to stubborn folks. Travis stepped closer, tapping a cattle prod against his leg in rhythm. Dwight shifted his jacket to show a pistol in his waistband. No attempt to hide it. Walter leaned even closer. Remember the Nolans, south of here? Bought up land in 2015. Haven't seen them around lately, have you? I drove home with Travis tailgating me the entire way. Close enough I could see his grin in my rear view. That night, we dragged our mattress into the walk-in closet, the only room without windows. We took turns sitting awake with the shotgun. Around midnight, the motion sensors tripped one by one, starting at the barn, then the goat pen, then moving toward the house. We heard the barn doors slam, then the goats screaming, high, panicked, not their normal calls. I started for the door, but Allison clutched my arm, begging me not to go out. We called 911. But the dispatcher said every unit was tied up on a major wreck along Route 35. At least 2 hours before anyone could come. We sat in that closet listening to the chaos outside, footsteps across the porch, someone rattling every doorknob, and then, worst of all, someone whistling Amazing Grace under our bedroom window. Allison clapped her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. When dawn came, we stepped outside to destruction. 3 of our goats dead, their bodies lined neatly at the barn door. the chicken coop smashed, feathers and blood everywhere. Most of the flock was simply gone, vanished. Spray paint across the barn wall read Sunday in red, so dark it looked like blood. All 4 tires on our truck were slashed, every greenhouse pane broken. They had poured oil into our well, gallons of it. And on our front gate, a dead coyote hung by its neck, a note pinned to its chest reading, "You're next." We called the sheriff again. This time the sheriff himself came, Sheriff Brenner, Walter's cousin. He walked the property, nodded at the carnage, and told us with a straight face it looked like wild animals. Maybe coyotes. When I showed him the spray paint and the note, he raised an eyebrow and said maybe we had staged it for insurance. Warned me he would investigate us for fraud if we filed a claim. We left that afternoon, packed what we could into Allison's car, abandoned the truck, and drove north without looking back. As we passed the Brenner place, all 4 of them were lined along the fence, watching. Walter gave us a slow, almost friendly wave. Travis raised his rifle and fired once into the air. 2 months later, the bank foreclosed. The Brenners bought our land at auction for pennies on the dollar. The auctioneer, I learned later, was married to Walter's niece. Our insurance claims were denied or buried in investigations. Every door we knocked on, lawyers, state police, even the FBI, told us without proof. It was just our word against theirs. And then came the whispers. An old neighbor, Mrs. Grady, called Allison one evening. Her voice was hushed like she feared someone might hear. She told us the Brenners had been pulling this stunt for decades, running families off, poisoning their stock, destroying their crops. Everyone in town knew, but nobody dared stand up to them because the Brenner family's connections stretch everywhere, from the courthouse to the bank to the sheriff's office. Now we are here in Cleveland, crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment, trying to piece our lives back together. Allison does not talk about copper, but sometimes I catch her looking at old photos and wiping her eyes before closing the phone. I have gone back to construction. She is working in a dentist's office. We tell people we used to have a farm in Ohio, but we do not elaborate. Some nights, I wake at 3 in the morning, certain I hear that whistling outside the window, even though we are 8 stories up. Last month, a plain manila envelope arrived at our mailbox. No return address. Inside was a glossy photo of our old farmhouse. The garden was gone, replaced by grazing cattle. And there they were, the Brenners, standing on our porch, smiling at the camera. On the back, written in thick black ink, were 3 words. "Thanks for improving." I burned it in the sink, but Allison saw the ashes. The next morning, she applied for a job in Portland. We are moving again next month. Because sometimes the only way to survive is to run far enough that they cannot reach you and hope the next place does not have its own Brenners waiting. Most people dream about retiring to the countryside for peace and quiet, right? Well, let me tell you about the nightmare that unfolded when my wife Jennifer and I bought our little farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania back in 2017. We'd saved for 15 years to escape the city grind. Found this perfect 20-acre property with a renovated 1940s farmhouse, complete with a red barn and a creek running through the back. The realtor mentioned our neighbor to the east, Harold Fitzgerald, had been farming the adjacent land for 40 years. She said he was particular about his property lines. That should have been our first warning. But we were too excited about our vegetable garden plans and the chicken coop we wanted to build. The day we moved in, Harold was already standing at our shared fence line with a surveyor's map, explaining exactly where our property ended and his began. Within the first week, Harold had visited us 4 times, each visit more uncomfortable than the last. He'd show up unannounced, always carrying that same laminated survey map, pointing out violations we didn't even know we were committing. Our moving truck had apparently driven 3 feet onto his access road, leaving tire marks he photographed extensively. Jennifer had walked our golden retriever, Bailey, along what we thought was a public path. But Harold produced documents showing he'd purchased those rights in 1993. He spoke in this measured, quiet tone that never quite matched the intensity in his pale blue eyes, like he was struggling to contain something darker. He installed motion sensor lights along our entire shared property line, flooding our bedroom with harsh white light whenever a deer wandered through. When I asked him about it, he said he needed to monitor the boundary integrity and suggested we install blackout curtains if it bothered us. The real problem started about 2 months in, when we decided to repair the old fence on our western boundary. Harold appeared within minutes of the contractor's arrival, demanding to see permits and property surveys, even though the fence was nowhere near his land. We discovered he de-installed cameras, at least 6 of them we could count, all aimed at different angles of our property. The contractor, a local guy named Brett, pulled me aside and warned me that Harold had driven off 3 different families from our property over the past decade. "Man measures his corn rows with a ruler," Brett said. Filed complaints against the Johnsons because their maple tree dropped leaves on his side. That evening, Harold left a typed letter in our mailbox, 3 pages long, detailing the proper protocols for any modifications to our property, including a requirement to notify him 72 hours in advance of any work crews arriving. Things escalated that Friday when Jennifer planted sunflowers along our side of the fence. I was in town getting supplies when Harold confronted her, claiming the flowers would attract birds that might eat his corn seed. Jennifer tried to explain they were 30 feet from his crops, but Harold had already taken dozens of photos, documenting what he called agricultural sabotage. He started showing up at odd hours, sometimes at 5 o'clock in the morning, sometimes near midnight, always finding some reason to complain. Our porch light was too bright and disrupted his chickens' laying schedule. Our guests parked too close to the road. The smell from our compost bin was carrying over to his property. He'd stand there with his clipboard, making notes while he talked, never raising his voice, but somehow making every word feel like a threat. The other neighbors, the Andersons to our west, started avoiding us. Later, I learned Harold had told them we were problem residents who didn't respect rural traditions. The morning everything changed was a Saturday in late July. I woke up to Jennifer crying in the kitchen, staring out the window at our chicken coop. All 6 of our chickens were dead, arranged in a perfect line along the fence that bordered Harold's property. Their necks had been wrung, and someone had placed them precisely 18 inches apart, measured exactly. I knew it was exact because there was a measuring tape still lying there, one of those old metal ones with HF engraved on the side. When I confronted Harold, he was already in his barn cleaning his boots with methodical precision. He looked up at me with this blank expression and said, "Your chickens had been trespassing on my land repeatedly." In farming communities, there are consequences for poor animal husbandry. He suggested I check my property more carefully, maybe install better fencing, and then went back to cleaning his boots like we'd been discussing the weather. I called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Morrison just looked tired when he arrived. He took photos, made notes, but explained that without direct evidence, there wasn't much he could do. "Harold's been here longer than anyone," he said. "Never been caught doing anything illegal." That afternoon, I found Harold installing a new camera on a pole right at our property line. This one with a speaker system attached. He waved at me while adjusting the angle, making sure it captured our entire backyard. Jennifer wanted to leave right then, pack everything, and go back to the city, but I convinced her we couldn't let him drive us away. We'd invested everything in this place. That night, the speaker crackled to life at 2 a.m. with Harold's voice, informing us that our dog had been barking for approximately 4 minutes and reminding us about county noise ordinances. Over the next 3 days, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic and frightening. He started patrolling our fence line every 4 hours, day and night, carrying a long stick that he'd drag along the fence posts, creating this rhythmic metallic sound that echoed across our property. Jennifer found him standing in our vegetable garden one morning, pulling up our tomato plants and examining their roots. When she screamed at him to leave, he calmly explained he was checking for agricultural diseases that might spread to his crops. He cited some obscure farming statute from 1952 that he claimed gave him the right. He filled our mailbox with printed articles about property disputes that had ended badly, headlines highlighted in yellow marker. One evening, we came home to find he'd painted perfect straight lines across our lawn, marking what he called optimal mowing patterns for rural properties. The paint soaked deep into the grass we'd spent months nurturing. The Andersons finally broke their silence when Harold poisoned their pond. They'd stocked it with bass and bluegill 3 years earlier. And one morning, every single fish was floating belly up in water that reeked of industrial pesticide. Harold claimed runoff from their improperly maintained septic system had been contaminating his groundwater. He showed them his own water tests that nobody could verify. That same week, the Brennans on the other side of Harold's property found their prized dairy cow dead in the field, foam around its mouth suggesting poisoning. Harold expressed sympathy, mentioned how dangerous wild plants could be if property wasn't properly maintained, and offered to help them identify problematic vegetation. The veterinarian found traces of ethylene glycol in the cow's system, basically antifreeze, but again, no proof of how it got there. We all knew, though. We started having meetings at the Anderson place. 5 families comparing notes, realizing Harold had been systematically terrorizing each of us, always staying just within legal boundaries. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning when I found Bailey convulsing in our yard. Our beautiful golden retriever was dying, white foam around his mouth, his body jerking in ways that still haunt me. Jennifer held him while I drove frantically to the emergency vet, but he died in her arms before we got halfway there. The vet found rat poison in his system, the kind Harold bought in bulk from the farm supply store. When we got home, shattered and empty, Harold was pressure washing his driveway. He stopped to tell us he'd seen strange dogs around his property lately. Suggested we should have kept better control of our animal. The way he said it, with that slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, I knew he wanted me to know it was him. I lunged at him, but Jennifer grabbed my arm. Harold just stood there with the pressure washer still running, daring me to cross onto his property, his finger hovering over his phone to call the police. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just sat on our porch with my father's old hunting rifle across my lap, watching Harold's house. Around 3 a.m., I saw him walking through our property with a flashlight and what looked like a pesticide sprayer. He was methodically spraying something along the edges of our vegetable garden, taking his time, knowing I was watching. When he saw me stand up, he waved the flashlight in my direction and shouted that he was treating for invasive insects that were threatening his crops. He said he had all the proper documentation if I wanted to check. Jennifer found me at dawn, still sitting there, the rifle now fully loaded. And she knew we'd reached a point where someone was going to die if we didn't do something drastic. The other families were just as desperate. Mrs. Anderson had started having panic attacks, and Brett Brennan was talking about handling things the old way, which scared me almost as much as Harold did. The solution came from the most unexpected place: Harold's own obsession with control. Jennifer had been secretly recording everything for weeks with her phone. But the real breakthrough came when the Brennans' teenage son, Kevin, revealed he'd hacked into Harold's camera system. The old farmer had been recording everything, creating detailed logs of every violation he witnessed, building what he probably thought was evidence against us. But Kevin found something else in those files. Harold had recorded himself poisoning the Andersons' pond, documenting the correct mixture of chemicals to eliminate aquatic trespassing. He'd filmed himself placing tainted meat along our fence line, narrating how this would solve the dog problem permanently. There were dozens of videos. Harold's own voice calmly explaining his actions, justifying every sick thing he'd done as protecting his property rights. The FBI got involved when we found videos suggesting he'd done similar things at his previous farm in Ohio, where a family's house had mysteriously burned down after they refused to sell him their land. Harold was arrested on a Sunday morning while adjusting his cameras. He didn't resist, just kept insisting the deputies needed to follow proper procedures, demanding they stay off certain parts of his property even as they put him in handcuffs. The investigation revealed he'd been documenting his harassment campaigns for 23 years across 4 different states, keeping meticulous records that ultimately became his downfall. He's serving 15 years now in federal prison, and we've slowly started to heal. Though Jennifer still can't plant anything near that fence line, the other families stayed, and we became closer than any neighbors I've ever had, bonded by what we survived together. Sometimes I still hear phantom sounds of that stick dragging along the fence posts at night, but it's just the wind. Harold's farm was sold to a young couple from California who turned it into a lavender farm. And the smell drifting over on summer evenings almost makes you forget what happened there. Almost. My family had owned our Kansas farm for 3 generations, nearly 400 acres of wheat and soybeans, with a farmhouse built by my grandfather's hands. It was the kind of land that tied itself to your blood, the type of place where every fence post and grain bin carried a story. When my parents passed, my sister Ellen and I inherited it. She lived in Denver and wanted to sell her half. I could not blame her, but I could not bear the thought of the place leaving our family's name. I scraped together every loan I could, bought her out, and became the sole owner in 2019. That was when the trouble with the Walkers really began. The Walkers owned the property adjoining ours to the south. Their family had been there almost as long as mine, though our grandfathers had hated each other with a passion. The feud was older than me, older than my father. Arguments over irrigation rights, accusations about moving property markers, even fights in church parking lots. When I was a kid, my dad would spit on the ground anytime he said the name Walker. I thought it was just an old grudge. But grudges on farmland do not fade. They fester. After Ellen sold her half to me, the walkers started making offers to buy my land too. They wanted the full section for themselves. When I refused, things got ugly. It started with subtle sabotage. One morning I found the spigot on my irrigation pump left open, thousands of gallons wasted overnight. Another time, someone had cut the wires on my grain dryer, just enough that it would fail in the middle of a cycle and ruin the batch. Every time I confronted Rick Walker, the eldest son who ran their side now, he would just smirk and shrug. "Accidents happen out here," he would say. The real fight started during harvest season of 2020. My wheat was ready a week before theirs, and I had crews working sunrise to sunset. When I woke up one morning, nearly 20 acres had been mowed down in perfect straight rows. Not harvested, just destroyed and left to rot in the dirt. The sheriff came out, looked at the damage, and said what they always said: without proof, nothing could be done. Everyone in the county knew the walkers had done it, but nobody was willing to stand up against them. That night, I caught Rick on my property. It was just past midnight, and I saw headlights by the north fence. I grabbed my rifle and walked out there, my dog Max trailing close behind. Rick was standing at the fence line with a gas can, grinning like he had been waiting for me. "You're in over your head," he told me. "This land wants to be ours. It always has. You can fight us, but the dirt remembers." The way he said it made my skin crawl. It was not just a threat. It was like he truly believed the soil itself was on his side. I told him if I ever caught him on my land again, I would not bother calling the sheriff. He laughed, this low, ugly sound, and walked back into the darkness. 2 weeks later, Max disappeared. I searched for him day and night, calling until my voice broke. I found him 3 days later on the edge of the property line. He had been poisoned, laid out like a warning. Something inside me broke that day. Losing crops was one thing. Losing Max was family. I started sleeping with the rifle by the door, cameras mounted on every corner of the house, floodlights ready to catch anything that moved. It was not enough. In January 2021, the barn caught fire. I woke to the smell of smoke, sprinted outside barefoot into the snow, and saw flames tearing through the roof. The livestock inside were screaming, and by the time the fire department made it out from town, everything was gone. 12 head of cattle, 2 horses, equipment worth more than I could ever replace. The insurance adjuster said the fire was deliberate. Accelerants had been used, but without evidence of who lit the match, I got nothing but a fraction of the payout. After that, I stopped sleeping. I would sit in the kitchen with the lights off, watching the tree line. I knew they were out there. I could feel them watching me back. The last straw came in March. I woke to the sound of my front door creaking open. I grabbed the rifle, crept down the stairs, and found muddy boot prints leading through my living room into the kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely keep my hands steady. That was when I heard it whispering. Not outside, inside, low voices carrying from the mudroom. I swung the rifle up and shouted, but when I hit the light, the room was empty. Just the prints leading out the back door. I called the sheriff again, but they found nothing. No tracks in the fresh snow, no signs of forced entry. It was like the prints had just ended in the middle of the yard. I could not take it anymore. I sold the land 3 months later to a developer from Wichita. The walkers tried to buy it first, of course, but I was not about to give them what they wanted. Let them choke on watching someone else plow it under for subdivisions. Still, Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear Rick's voice saying the dirt remembers. And part of me wonders if I gave up more than just land that day. People always ask me why I left Nebraska after 15 years of working the same farm. The truth is, after what happened that night in October 2022, I could not stand being alone in those fields anymore. I was 34, divorced, no kids, and I had been managing the Brennan family's cattle operation since I got out of the Army. It was honest work. Feeding the livestock, checking fences, making sure the water systems kept running through those brutal winters. The property sat on about 800 acres outside a town you have probably never heard of, population barely pushing 2,000. Most nights, the only sounds were the cattle shifting in their pens and maybe a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. I lived in a small house on the property. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with a kitchen that leaked when it rained hard, and a porch where I would sit with my coffee every morning, watching the sun come up over the cornfields. The neighboring farm belonged to the Novak family, and their daughter Cassie had been spiraling for about 3 years by then. She was maybe 28, used to be pretty before meth got its hooks in her. She had long auburn hair, she cut off one night with kitchen scissors, leaving jagged chunks that stuck out at strange angles. Her dad, Frank, was a quiet man who raised soybeans and kept to himself after his wife died of cancer. Cassie would show up at my place maybe twice a month, always with some story about needing gas money or her phone being shut off. She picked at sores on her arms while she talked, her eyes darting around like she was watching for something nobody else could see. I usually gave her $20 just to get her to leave, because arguing was pointless. She would just come back the next night, knocking louder, sometimes throwing gravel at my bedroom window until I came outside. That particular Sunday started normal enough. I spent the morning fixing a section of fence the bulls had knocked down, then drove into town for groceries around noon. The cashier at the Save-A-Lot, Beverly, mentioned she had seen Cassie at the gas station earlier, arguing with the manager about something. Beverly had this way of lowering her voice when she gossiped, leaning across the register like we were sharing state secrets. She said Cassie looked worse than usual, wearing this oversized green jacket, even though it was almost 70 degrees out. She kept pacing in circles by the pump, talking to herself. I just nodded and loaded my groceries, figured it was none of my business. By the time I got back to the farm, the sun was already starting to dip low, painting everything in burnt orange that made the fields look like they were on fire. I remember thinking it was too quiet. Usually Frank's dogs would be barking by then, 2 German shepherds that lost their minds every time a car drove past. I was in the barn around 8 o'clock that night, treating a calf with an infected hoof, when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Not normal walking, more like someone stumbling, catching themselves, stumbling again. The barn door scraped open, and there was Cassie. Something was different this time. Her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked completely black. She had a sheen of sweat across her forehead, even though the temperature had dropped to maybe 50 degrees. She was wearing that same green jacket Beverly mentioned, but now I could see dark stains on the sleeves that looked almost brown in the barn's fluorescent lights. Her hands kept clenching and unclenching, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I noticed her bottom lip was split, blood dried in the corner. "I need your truck," she said. Not asked, but said like it was already decided. "And I need $300 right now." The way she emphasized those last 2 words made every instinct from my military days kick in. This was not her usual begging. This was desperation mixed with something else. Something that made me automatically take a step back toward the tool wall. I told her I did not have that kind of cash on me, which was true. I maybe had $40 in my wallet. She started laughing, but it was not a real laugh. More like a broken sound that came out in bursts. "You don't understand," she kept saying, walking deeper into the barn, her sneakers leaving strange smudges on the concrete floor. That was when I noticed the pattern. The prints were not just dirt. They had a reddish tint that left streaks behind each step. She started grabbing things off the shelves. A rope, some wire cutters, then dropped them like she forgot what she was looking for. "They are coming," she said, spinning around to face me. "I can hear their radios already. Can you hear them?" I could not hear anything except the calf breathing heavy in its pen and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. She pulled something out of her jacket pocket, and for a second, I thought it was a gun. But it was just her phone. The screen was cracked so badly you could barely see anything on it. She kept pressing buttons that were not there, her fingers jabbing at nothing, muttering numbers that did not make sense. The smell hit me then, metallic and thick, like when you butcher a deer and do not clean up right away. It was coming from her clothes, especially that jacket. She must have seen me notice, because she suddenly pulled it tighter around herself, even though she was burning up, hair sticking to her neck with sweat. "Frank had an accident," she said, but the way she said accident, drawing it out like she was tasting the word, made my chest tighten. "He fell in the kitchen, hit his head on something." She would not look at me when she said it, her eyes fixed on something past my shoulder, out in the darkness beyond the barn door. I asked if we needed to call an ambulance, already reaching for my phone, but she lunged forward and grabbed my wrist with both hands. Her grip was stronger than someone her size should have been capable of, fingernails digging in deep enough that I found crescent marks of dry blood later. "No ambulance," she hissed. "Just the truck, please. I will go to Colorado. I know people there. They will help me figure this out." That was when we both heard it. Sirens, still far off but getting closer. That distinctive wail cutting through the night air. Cassie's whole body went rigid, like someone had run electricity through her. She let go of my wrist and bolted for the barn door, but stopped at the threshold, looking out at the darkness. The yard light clicked on when she moved, illuminating her in a harsh white glow that made the stains on her clothes look almost purple. "You were always nice to me," she said, not turning around, "even when everyone else crossed the street when they saw me coming. Remember that time you fixed my car? That winter when the radiator cracked? I did remember. It was 2 years ago, before things got really bad, when she still had moments of being the girl who used to win 4-H competitions and help her mom sell pies at the county fair. She took off running then, not toward the road, but into the cornfields, disappearing between the rows that had not been harvested yet. The stalks were dry and brittle this late in the season, and I could hear her crashing through them for maybe 30 seconds before the sound faded into nothing. I stood there in the barn for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, trying to process what had just happened. The sirens were definitely getting closer now, and I could see red and blue lights flickering against the clouds from the direction of the Novak farm. My first thought was to follow her, try to talk sense into her, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe self-preservation. Maybe just the knowledge that whatever had happened at Frank's place, I did not want to be the one to find out. I walked back to my house, legs feeling like they were made of water, and locked the door behind me for the first time since I had moved in. Through my kitchen window, I could see the emergency vehicles pulling into Frank's driveway. At least 4 police cars and an ambulance. They did not use their sirens once they arrived, which somehow made everything worse. Officers with flashlights started spreading out across the property, their beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One headed toward the cornfield where Cassie had disappeared, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for shouts or gunshots or something. But there was just the steady sweep of lights and the occasional crackle of radio chatter that I could not quite make out. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door. 3 solid raps that made me jump, even though I had been expecting it. 2 deputies stood on my porch, both young guys who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. The taller one, Officer Daniels according to his name tag, asked if I had seen Cassie Novak that night. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before telling them everything. Her showing up at the barn, asking for money and my truck, the stains on her clothes, how she had run into the cornfield. Daniels wrote everything down in his little notebook, while the other deputy, Reeves, kept glancing back toward the Novak farm. "Sir, we are going to need you to stay inside tonight," Daniels said when I finished. "Lock your doors and windows. If she comes back, do not let her in. Call 911 immediately." That was when Reeves finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Frank Novak is dead. Someone shot him with his own hunting rifle, then beat him with it." The words just hung there in the October air, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. They found her the next morning, almost 10 miles away, walking along County Road 12 in nothing but a t-shirt and jeans. She had ditched the green jacket somewhere in the fields. A farmer named Dennis Briggs called it in, said she was just walking down the middle of the road, talking to herself, her feet bloody from running through the harvested corn fields barefoot. The deputies who picked her up said she did not resist, just kept asking them if they could stop at McDonald's on the way to the station because she had not eaten in 3 days. The full story came out over the next few weeks through the local newspaper and courthouse gossip. She had been awake for 4 days straight, convinced Frank was poisoning her food, putting cameras in her bedroom, reporting her to the D. The prosecution said she had taken his hunting rifle from the garage, a Z Winchester Model 70 he had bought for his 60th birthday, waited for him to come home from checking his soybeans, and shot him once in the chest when he walked through his back door. When he did not die right away, when he tried to crawl toward the phone in the living room, she finished it with the rifle butt. The coroner said it took him maybe 20 minutes to die, leaving a trail of blood from the kitchen to the hallway where they found him. The trial lasted 3 days. I had to testify about that night in the barn, sitting in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor wax, looking at Cassie in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. She had gained weight in county jail, her face fuller, her eyes clear for the first time in years. When the prosecutor asked me to describe her state that night, I looked right at her and she gave me a small nod, like she was giving me permission to tell the truth. Her court-appointed lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, brought in experts to talk about methamphetamine psychosis, how someone could completely lose touch with reality after days without sleep. But the jury only took 4 hours to come back with guilty on second-degree murder, 25 to life. When they read the verdict, Cassie did not react at all, just stared at her hands folded on the defendant's table. Her father's sister, Nancy, was the only family member who showed up. She sat in the back row, crying quietly into a handkerchief with little blue flowers embroidered on it. I left Nebraska 2 months after the trial ended. I could not handle the empty Novak farmhouse next door, the yellow police tape that stayed up for weeks, the way Frank's soybeans just rotted in the field because no one harvested them. The Brennans understood when I gave my notice. They even helped me find a job with a ranch operation in Wyoming. Sometimes I still dream about that night. Not nightmares exactly, just replaying those moments in the barn, wondering if I could have done something different. If I had given her the truck keys, would Frank still be alive? Or would there have been 2 bodies instead of 1? The detective told me later they found the green jacket she had been wearing, half buried in a drainage ditch 3 miles from where they picked her up. It was Frank's jacket, one he wore for hunting, and the stains I had seen were exactly what I thought they were. He also told me something that still bothers me. They found my name written on a piece of paper in her pocket, along with 4 other names I did not recognize. When I asked what that meant, he just shrugged and said they would probably never know. Cassie took a plea deal to avoid trial for premeditated murder, and she never explained the list. I still wake up sometimes wondering if I was supposed to be next, or if that paper meant something else entirely. Something only a mind twisted by 4 days of sleepless paranoia could understand. In 2011, Oklahoma baked under one of the worst droughts in living memory. I had just taken over my uncle's farm outside Lawton, 300 acres of hard, cracked soil that had once produced some of the best sorghum in the county. My uncle passed suddenly that spring, and being the only family left, I moved down from Tulsa to take on the responsibility. Everyone said I was crazy. The land had not produced in years, water rights were tightening, and the ground was so dry you could push a stick in and hear it splinter against the rock below. But it was not just about crops for me. My uncle raised me after my dad died, and this land was all I had left of him. I could not let it die. The neighbors were not welcoming. Farming communities usually have a way of rallying around newcomers, but not here. People kept their distance, offering curt nods at the feed store, whispering when they thought I could not hear. One older farmer, Earl Simmons, told me point blank that outsiders did not last long on this stretch of prairie. Soil eats them alive, he said, like the dirt itself was hungry. By midsummer, the drought turned brutal. Temperatures soared past 110 for days at a time, and the sky did not give us a single drop. My irrigation well, which the county had assured me was good, ran dry within weeks. I dug deeper, spent money I did not have on contractors, but the water table had dropped so far, even the new pump sputtered. That was when the nights started getting strange. At first, it was small things. The sound of boots crunching gravel outside when I knew I was alone. The barn door swinging open even though I had latched it tight. I told myself it was the wind or coyotes, but the feeling of being watched lingered no matter where I went. One evening, around midnight, I was sitting on the porch drinking warm beer and staring at the empty sky when I saw lights moving across my fields. Not car headlights, not flashlights. They glowed a dull orange, weaving slowly between the dead sorghum rows. At first, I thought it was kids from town messing around, but the lights moved too deliberately, like they were searching for something. I grabbed my rifle and walked out, but the closer I got, the dimmer the lights became until they vanished completely. All that remained was the dry rattle of the wind moving through the stalks. The next morning, I found patterns burned into the soil where the lights had been. Circles, almost perfect. The ground blackened like it had been scorched from above. When I mentioned it at the diner in town, the conversations around me died instantly. People stared into their coffee, not meeting my eyes. The waitress, a woman named Carla, who had served me since the day I arrived, leaned in and said quietly, "Don't ask about the lights. Just let it be." I tried. God knows I tried, but the lights kept coming back. By August, I was running out of money and sleep. The lights appeared 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. I would hear whispering outside my window, words I could not make out, carried on the hot wind. Tools went missing from the shed, only to reappear arranged in precise straight lines across the yard. One morning, I found every fence post around my property marked with strange, crude carvings, spirals, and jagged X's burned deep into the wood. I thought maybe it was the Walkers again, the same family that had terrorized neighbors in other counties. But no, this was different. Too quiet. Too exact. The breaking point came on a night in late August when the air was so dry it hurt to breathe. I woke to the sound of cattle screaming. I ran barefoot across the yard and found 3 of them lying dead in the field, their bodies twisted unnaturally, eyes wide, tongues black. No wounds, no blood, just dead, like life itself had been sucked out. The sheriff came, shrugged, and said the drought was killing livestock all across the county. But I saw the scorch marks under their bodies. Perfect circles burned into the soil where they had fallen. After that, I started sleeping in the truck with a rifle across my lap. Every night, the lights came closer. Sometimes I could see them through the cracks in the barn, glowing just beyond the cattle pens. One night, I finally snapped. I fired 3 shots into the fields where the lights flickered. The sound echoed across the dry land, but when the dust settled, the lights did not vanish. They just stopped moving, frozen in place. Then, one by one, they blinked out, leaving me in silence so thick I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. The next morning, every well on my property, the old one, the new one, even the shallow hand-dug well from my grandfather's day, had collapsed. The soil caved in overnight, leaving nothing but gaping holes where water should have been. That was it. I could not keep going. I packed up the truck and left before the sun set again. I sold the farm at a loss to a corporation out of state. Last I heard, they bulldozed half of it to put up wind turbines, but the other half sits untouched. No one plants, no one grazes. Sometimes, late at night, I will be driving on those endless Oklahoma highways, and I will see them again. Orange lights, low to the ground, moving slowly across the horizon. Always just far enough away to make me wonder if I imagined it, but close enough to know I did not. And I remember what Earl Simmons said, "The soil eats people alive." Maybe he was not talking about drought at all. Texas ranching is not for the faint of heart. You spend long days under a sun that feels like it is trying to burn straight through your skin, nights listening to coyotes howl in the distance, and mornings praying the water troughs have not gone dry. I had been running our family's cattle operation outside Abilene since my father passed in 2009. 2,000 head of Angus spread across rough land that had chewed up better men than me. By 2016, the work was wearing me thin. I hired on a ranch hand named Miguel Ortega, a quiet man in his 30s who came with good references from a spread down near San Angelo. He worked hard, never complained, and could rope, ride, and mend fence like he had been born to it. I trusted him enough that by the second month, I let him live in the old bunkhouse on the property. The first sign something was wrong came late one night that July. I woke to the sound of cattle bawling, the kind of panicked noise that makes your stomach drop. I grabbed a flashlight and found Miguel already out there in the dark, standing still by the fence line, staring into the mesquite trees. When I asked what he saw, he did not answer. He just shook his head slowly and whispered, "Not ours." I looked, but there was nothing. Only shadows moving in the heat shimmer. The next morning, Miguel was back to normal. He worked the herd like nothing happened, but when I pressed him about the night before, he changed the subject. Over the next weeks, odd things piled up. Tools went missing from the barn, only to reappear in strange places. The generator in the bunkhouse kept shutting off at exactly 3 in the morning. Miguel started making crosses out of scrap wood and hammering them into the ground around his quarters. He said it was protection. I chalked it up to superstition until the night he woke me by pounding on my door, shouting in Spanish so fast I could barely catch it. I followed him out to the north pasture where half a dozen cattle stood clustered together, trembling, eyes rolling white. The air smelled sharp, like ozone after a storm, though the sky was clear. Miguel pointed to the ground. There was a perfect circle of scorched grass, maybe 20 feet across, still smoking in the cool night air. The cattle would not go near it. I wanted to call the sheriff, but what was I supposed to say? That the devil dropped by my pasture? A week later, Miguel was gone. I found the bunkhouse empty, the bed neatly made, his few belongings left behind. Boots lined up by the wall, hat on the peg, wallet and ID sitting on the nightstand. The only thing missing was Miguel himself. There were tracks leading from the bunkhouse out into the pasture, barefoot prints pressed deep into the dust. They went straight through the mesquite, across a dry creek bed, and ended in the middle of another burned circle, larger this time, maybe 30 feet across. No prints leaving, no signs of a struggle, just ended. I called the sheriff then. They brought dogs, helicopters, volunteers. We combed every inch of that land for 3 days. Nothing, not a trace. The official story was that Miguel walked away. Maybe crossed the border, maybe got lost and died out in the scrub. But I knew better. That winter, I tried to move on, hired a new hand, focused on the herd. But sometimes, in the dead hours before dawn, I would hear the generator in the bunkhouse sputter to life, even though it had been disconnected. Or I would find fresh crosses hammered into the dirt where Miguel used to work. The worst was the night I woke to voices outside. Low, murmuring voices speaking a language I did not recognize. I looked out the window and saw figures standing in the pasture, just on the edge of the moonlight. 5, maybe 6 of them, tall and thin, their outlines shimmering like heat haze. I blinked and they were gone. The next morning, another circle of scorched earth marked the spot where they had stood. It has been nearly 10 years since Miguel disappeared, and I still run cattle on that land. I have never spoken of this outside family, not even to the deputies who still ask about him once a year. But sometimes, when the night is still and the stars are sharp above the prairie, I swear I hear footsteps in the dirt outside the bunkhouse. Barefoot, slow, steady. and I wonder if Miguel ever really left. When my grandmother passed in 2018, I inherited her old farmhouse in western North Dakota. My family had left the property decades earlier, moving into town after the oil boom dried up, but Grandma had insisted on staying until the very end. She said the land was her anchor, the place she had poured her entire life into, and she refused to leave, no matter how many times she was urged to. The house stood alone on the prairie, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was a 2-story frame home that had once been painted white, though by the time I arrived, the boards had weathered to a brittle gray. The prairie winds had sanded them bare, and the windows rattled in their frames, even on nights when the air outside was completely still. From the road, it looked abandoned and forgotten, a shell of a life that had long since gone quiet. I drove up in late October with the intention of sorting through her belongings and preparing the property to be sold. The grass around the house reached almost to my waist, swaying in brittle waves, except where a narrow path ran from the porch to the chicken coop. The mailbox tilted on its post, its rusted door jammed with years of unpaid bills and waterlogged flyers that no one had ever bothered to collect. Inside, it felt as though she had only stepped out for a moment. The floral wallpaper curled in strips from the corners. Dust coated the mantel and shelves, and the air carried the sharp scent of mothballs. Crucifixes hung in nearly every room, some nailed straight, others dangling crooked as if the walls themselves had grown tired. Her cane leaned against the kitchen table, waiting to be picked up again. It unsettled me more than I expected. I told myself I would only stay a few nights while I packed her things. The first night, I chose her bedroom because it was less cluttered than the others. That decision still weighs on me. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow and heavy, each board groaning as though someone wanted me to hear. The steps paused directly outside the door. I held my breath until my chest hurt, then forced myself to reach for the flashlight beside the bed. I called out, but the silence that followed was complete. When I opened the door, the hallway stretched empty, shadows stretching and shrinking under the beam of my light. I searched every room but found nothing. The next morning, I noticed the crucifix that had hung above the bed was gone. It lay neatly folded on the dresser, the chain carefully coiled as though it had been placed there with intention. That detail unnerved me far more than the footsteps. On the second night, I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. I told myself it would be easier to keep an eye on the front door that way. At some point after 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the door slamming shut. My heart raced, and I stumbled to the porch only to find the door still locked. The dust on the boards had not shifted. When I stepped back inside, I smelled something I had not experienced in years: Grandma's rose perfume. It drifted past me, faint but unmistakable, carrying memories of evenings when she would sit brushing her hair before bed. I froze, staring at the mantel where dozens of family photographs had stood for as long as I could remember. The frames were all turned backward. Every single picture faced the wall. By the third night, I had given up trying to rest. I brewed coffee and sat in the kitchen, determined to stay awake until sunrise. The lamp on the table cast a dim circle of light, but beyond it the house felt too large, as if the shadows were pressing inward. At 3:15 in the morning, the old AM radio on the counter sputtered to life. The dial had been frozen for years, the speaker crusted with dust, yet through the static came a voice. Clear, fragile, and familiar. It was hers. Grandma's voice called my name, over and over, soft and pleading, like a warning spoken across some impossible distance. I could not stay another moment. I packed nothing and left before dawn, driving back to Bismarck without once glancing in the rearview mirror. The farmhouse seemed to linger behind me like a shadow I could not shake. And I knew if I looked back, I would see her in the upstairs window, watching me leave. I never sold the place. I could not bring myself to sign it over to strangers, but I could not bring myself to return either. It sits boarded and hollow now, the prairie swallowing it inch by inch. Friends tell me they sometimes see lights flicker in the upstairs windows when they pass on late nights. They laugh and call it prairie ghosts. I do not laugh. Grandma lived and died in that house, and I am certain a part of her still walks its halls. But I am equally certain that something else lingers there with her. Something that is not family. Something that does not want anyone else living beneath that roof. Years later, the dreams still come. I walk the upstairs hallway, but it stretches longer than it should, with doors multiplying on both sides. Behind each one is a room I never knew existed, draped in sheets that shiver as though something beneath them is trying to breathe. Whispers rise from behind the fabric, my name repeated in tones that do not belong to my grandmother. When I wake, I sometimes smell roses. The deed stays locked away, buried among papers I rarely touch. The house is still mine by law, but it does not feel like it belongs to me. On quiet nights, when the wind howls across the prairie, I imagine it standing there in the dark, its windows trembling, its boards groaning. Some houses should never be sold. Some houses keep what they want. Dear folks, thank you so much for enjoying tonight's stories. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel. This way, you keep the darkness coming. Until next time.